April 1945. The final weeks of World War II. Berlin burns, the sky red with fire and ash as the Third Reich collapses under the weight of its own madness. Deep in the Bavarian Alps, far from the front lines, a man works in silence. His name is Dr. Heinrich Vogel, a physicist whose genius was matched only by his obsession. While cities fell and armies surrendered, Vogel stayed underground, literally conducting experiments the Reich had deemed essential for the future of humanity. Officially, his work didn't exist. No records, no witnesses. Just rumors of an underground complex carved into the side of a mountain, powered by stolen generators and protected by SS guards who answered only to him. Allied intelligence called it Die Morgenrote Anlage, the Dawn Facility. They didn't know what was being built there, only that whatever it was terrified even the high command. One intercepted message mentioned energy beyond uranium and displacement phenomena. Then the transmissions stopped. When the Americans advanced south and the British took the northern routes, Vogel and his team were gone. The entrances sealed, the documents burned, the valley eerily quiet. Days later, a single message crackled through a shortwave frequency believed to originate near the Alps. "The experiment is complete, God forgive us." The transmission lasted 6 seconds. Then silence. No trace of Vogel, no trace of his staff, 31 scientists, engineers and soldiers, none ever found. Intelligence units scoured captured records, interrogated former SS officers, even searched the mountains by air. Nothing. It was as if the facility had been swallowed whole by the earth. In the chaos of post-war Europe, his disappearance faded into the noise, just one more ghost story in a continent filled with them. But buried in Allied reports was one chilling note, scribbled in pencil by an unnamed analyst. If Vogel's work succeeded, it may have ended more than just the war. In the years that followed Germany's surrender, a legend began to take shape. Soldiers returning from the Alps spoke of tunnels stretching for miles beneath the mountains, reinforced with concrete and steel, built not for defense but for escape. Locals called it the Alpine Fortress, a place where Nazi scientists and officers had supposedly retreated to continue their experiments. The Allies dismissed it as myth, wartime paranoia mixed with superstition, but strange things began to surface. Whole valleys were declared restricted zones on military maps with no explanation. Villagers reported hearing machinery humming beneath their feet long after the war had ended. Some swore they saw lights flickering under the snow at night, pulsing like the heartbeat of something buried alive. Yet when researchers went looking, there was nothing to find. No entrances, no blueprints, no mention of any facility matching the description. Files that should have contained Vogel's research were blank. His personnel record, missing. Even his birth certificate had been quietly removed from municipal archives. It was as if he had been erased from existence. By the 1952, stories of the underground Reich became Cold War folklore, whispered by soldiers stationed along the Iron Curtain. Some believed Vogel had escaped to Argentina under a false identity. Others claimed he'd been taken by the Soviets, his knowledge feeding a new generation of weapons research. But the locals around Oberammergau told a different story, that Vogel never left the mountains, that he was still down there, beneath the ice, keeping the machines running. And sometimes, on windless nights, you could still hear them, the low mechanical hum rising from deep below, where the dead refused to sleep. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the war may have ended, but the hunt for knowledge had just begun. The United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to seize the spoils of Germany's scientific empire: jet propulsion, rocketry, chemical warfare, and things far stranger. The Americans called it Operation Paperclip, a secret mission to recruit Nazi scientists before the Soviets could claim them. Trains rolled out of the ruins of Europe carrying men who had built the weapons of the Reich, now promised new lives in America. Among the stacks of captured documents, one file stood out: Dr. H. Vogel, physicist, classified location unknown. It was stamped top secret, and logged by the Office of Strategic Services, then abruptly removed from circulation. No one could explain who had taken it or why. Rumors spread through the intelligence community like wildfire. Some said Vogel had escaped through the rat lines to Argentina, vanishing into the jungles under a new name. Others believed the Soviets had found him first and hidden him within their nuclear program, working deep in Siberia under watchful eyes. Yet the truth was stranger still, because both sides were searching for him and neither ever claimed success. In 1952, a memo from the newly formed CIA referenced the Vogel problem, noting that all attempts to verify his death have failed. Another, dated 1957, simply read, "If alive, he may represent a technological advantage equivalent to the atomic bomb." But even as years passed, no trace emerged, no immigration records, no sightings, no family. Just a growing unease that one of Nazi Germany's most brilliant and dangerous minds had slipped through the cracks of history. By the mid-1960s, Vogel had become more myth than man, a ghost in the archives, a name whispered in laboratories whenever a new scientific breakthrough appeared decades ahead of its time. And for those who still remembered the intercepted message, "The experiment is complete, God forgive us." The silence that followed was worse than any confession. Summer, 1963. A farmer, plowing his field outside Garmisch-Partenkirchen, a quiet Bavarian town surrounded by jagged peaks, hits something solid beneath the soil. Expecting a stone, he digs deeper and unearths a rusted metal box sealed with wire. Inside, wrapped in decaying canvas, are notebooks old, water-stained, but unmistakably scientific. The ink has bled, the pages warped by moisture, yet across the margins runs a signature repeated over and over, H. Vogel. The handwriting is jagged, hurried, almost frantic. One page, miraculously legible, reads, "Below the mountain, the work continues." Within hours, local police arrive. They contact the German Federal Office for the Protection of the Constitution, who in turn notify American intelligence stationed in Munich. By nightfall, unmarked vehicles surround the property. The notebooks are packed into crates, and the area is cordoned off. The farmer is told to forget what he found. He never sees his land again. It's quietly purchased by the government weeks later. Inside the recovered documents are sketches of unfamiliar machinery, complex loops of copper wire, magnetic chambers, and circular structures labeled Antriebseinheit, or drive unit. There are also cryptic annotations referencing phase alignment and resonant containment fields, concepts decades ahead of the era. Most disturbing is a note written across the final page. "If the containment fails, seal the doors. No one must open them." The files disappear into classified storage. Official reports claim the discovery was of no historical significance. But witnesses remember the unease of the men who carried those notebooks away, how they handled them with gloved hands, as if afraid the ink itself might burn. For nearly 40 years, no one speaks of what was found beneath that Bavarian field. Yet in the mountains just beyond, hikers still whisper of strange lights that flicker beneath the snow, and of an unseen power humming deep below, where something long forgotten is still awake. By 1972, the story of Heinrich Vogel had faded into Cold War folklore, another ghost lost to the ashes of history. But deep in the forests near Oberammergau, whispers began again. That summer, 2 hikers descending from the Labor Mountain claimed to hear a sound low, rhythmic, and mechanical rising from beneath the ground. They described it as a hum, steady and deep, like an engine idling far below their feet. At first, no one believed them. Then more reports followed. Hunters who said their compasses spun wildly near certain ridgelines, surveyors whose instruments malfunctioned when placed on the rocky slopes, and villagers who swore that on clear nights they saw faint blue light seeping through cracks in the mountainside, pulsing slowly like a heartbeat. The stories spread quickly through the valley. Some blamed it on underground water currents, others on leftover munitions from the war. But older residents remembered the war years, the convoys of trucks heading into the mountains at night, the distant sounds of drilling, the orders to stay indoors after dark. One woman, now in her 70s, claimed her father once worked as a courier for a doctor who lived beneath the mountain. His name, she said, was Vogel. Journalists tried to investigate but were quickly shut down. German officials issued a statement calling the reports geological instability, explaining the hum as the natural resonance of shifting rock. Yet geologists found no record of seismic movement. The region was stable. Still, the government declared the area restricted for safety reasons, fencing off trails that had been open for generations. The locals knew better. They said the mountain was breathing again. A decade later, climbers still reported strange phenomena: dead birds scattered near crevices, watches stopping, radios picking up bursts of static filled with indecipherable Morse-like clicks. And sometimes, when the fog settled over the peaks, the air itself seemed to vibrate, carrying that same faint hum, the same mechanical sigh, like the groan of a machine that had never truly stopped running since the spring of 1945. By the late 1970s, both East and West were listening. Amid the paranoia of the Cold War, the Alps became a stage for shadows, the perfect place to hide a secret that neither superpower wanted the other to find. When strange signals began disrupting shortwave radio frequencies across southern Germany, American analysts traced the interference to a cluster of coordinates near Oberammergau, the same region long associated with the so-called Vogel legend. In 1981, declassified CIA field reports referenced thermal anomalies detected by reconnaissance satellites during winter flyovers. The images showed heat signatures bleeding through the snow, in patterns that didn't match any known geological source: long, rectangular zones, like corridors beneath the earth. A note scrawled in the margin read simply, "Artificial origin possible." Meanwhile, Soviet intelligence had been watching the same mountain range. KGB intercepts recovered years later revealed that 3 operatives were dispatched to investigate in 1982. They entered Bavaria through Czechoslovakia under forged passports. None returned. Their final radio transmission: entering tunnel, machinery audible, proceeding deeper, then silence. The CIA dubbed the location the Vogel site. In one top-secret memorandum dated the 12th of March 1983, a senior analyst summarized it bluntly: Vogel's disappearance now assessed as strategic relocation, not death. Possibility of surviving facility high. Recommend denial operations and containment. What exactly containment meant, no one outside the intelligence community ever knew, but soon afterward, the U.S. and West Germany jointly restricted aerial activity over a small patch of the Bavarian Alps. Maps were quietly edited. Tourist trails disappeared. To the public, the mountains remained beautiful, silent, and untouched. But to those who had seen the satellite photographs, they were something else entirely: a wound in the earth, still bleeding warmth, decades after the war that had birthed it was supposed to have ended. 1989. The Berlin Wall falls, and with it, the barriers that had divided a nation for half a century. Across Germany, forgotten bunkers and underground sites sealed by East German authorities are suddenly exposed to light for the first time since the war. Among the flood of historians, scavengers, and thrill-seekers who rush to explore them is a small group of urban explorers from Munich calling themselves Die Schattenläufer, the Shadow Runners. Their goal: to map the remnants of the Reich's underground facilities before they vanish under development or secrecy again. For weeks they crawl through tunnels, flooded chambers, and crumbling air raid shelters, filming everything on grainy handheld cameras. But in late November, deep beneath the forest near Oberammergau, they find something that doesn't appear on any wartime blueprint. A corridor of concrete, perfectly preserved, sealed by a rusted blast door, painted above the archway, barely visible beneath layers of grime, is the Reich Eagle, and beneath it, the letters V13. The group assumes it's another weapons bunker. They set up lights and begin filming as they try to pry the door open with crowbars. The air grows heavier the deeper they work, the silence broken only by the sound of dripping water and the metallic ring of steel on steel. When the first hinge gives way, a low hiss escapes from the crack, like a sigh exhaled from the mountain itself. Then, without warning, a blast of pressurized air knocks them backward, throwing two of the explorers to the ground. Their lights flicker out. One camera catches a single frame before it dies, a steel door gleaming under flashlight glare, engraved with a simple number, 13. When the group resurfaces, disoriented and terrified, they find that their film reels are ruined. Only one still photograph survives the door with its number, framed by the Reich Eagle above. Within days, government officials arrive, citing environmental hazards. The entrance is welded shut, and the area declared off-limits. The surviving explorers refuse to speak publicly. One moves abroad, another is later found dead in what authorities call a climbing accident. The photo of door 13 circulates briefly in conspiracy circles before vanishing into classified archives, and once again, the mountain goes silent. 5 years later, in 1994, a historian named Clara Stein begins digging through post-war intelligence records at the National Archives in Koblenz. She is researching Allied debriefings of captured German scientists when she finds something out of place. A private letter dated the 8th of July 1946, written by a U.S. intelligence officer stationed in Munich. The letter is addressed to his superior and marked, "Not for official transmission." It references an operation called Project Morgenröte, the Dawn Project. According to the letter, the project's objective was Energie aus dem Vakuum, energy from the vacuum. The officer writes that Vogel's team had allegedly succeeded in breaching a resonance threshold before vanishing, and warns that replicating the conditions might risk containment failure. Clara becomes consumed by the discovery. She requests further documents, but within weeks her access is revoked without explanation. A contact inside the Defense Ministry tells her the file was moved to American custody decades ago. Determined, she travels to Bavaria, retracing the locations mentioned in the letter: Garmisch, Oberammergau, the forests of Ettel. Locals remember her as polite but restless, always asking about the scientist under the mountain. In her hotel room, she fills notebooks with sketches and coded notes. Her last known entry, dated the 3rd of August 1995, reads simply, "If Morgenröte was real, the mountain is not a tomb, it's a machine." A week later, she is reported missing. Her car is found abandoned near a trailhead leading toward the Laber Massif, the same region where hikers once heard the strange hum beneath the earth. Rescue teams search for weeks but find no trace. Authorities rule it an accident, but those who reviewed her research say she was too close to whatever truth Heinrich Vogel had buried beneath the Bavarian stone. Some believe she found the entrance the explorers couldn't open. Others whisper that the mountain claimed her the moment she did. It was the summer of 2002 when a team of experienced spelunkers from Munich began charting a newly discovered karst system near Mittenwald, a small town nestled in the Bavarian Alps. The region was riddled with limestone caverns and sinkholes, many still uncharted since the war. The team expected a routine mapping expedition, tight passages, dripping stalactites, and the usual thrill of exploration. But deep within the mountain, 300 meters below the surface, they stumbled onto something that shouldn't have been there at all. The lead explorer, Jonas Adler, noticed a section of wall that looked different, too smooth, too deliberate. When they tapped it, the hollow echo confirmed what no one wanted to believe. It was man-made. After several hours of careful digging, the stone collapsed inward, revealing a tunnel of reinforced concrete, its edges lined with rusted steel supports. The air that escaped was heavy and metallic, warm enough to fog their headlamps. It smelled faintly of oil and ozone. The deeper they stepped, the more unnatural it felt. This was not part of any natural cave. This was built. The passage descended sharply, curving into darkness, each step echoing against the walls. The temperature rose as they went deeper, impossibly warm for a mountain interior. The sound of dripping water gave way to something else, a low hum, distant and steady, like a generator still running somewhere far below. One of the explorers raised his camera and caught a glimpse of something painted on the wall, faded but unmistakable, a double lightning bolt encircling an atom, the insignia of the Ahnenerbe Scientific Division, the Nazi organization responsible for their most secret and occult experiments. The moment the flash fired, a gust of air pushed through the tunnel, rattling their equipment. "It's breathing," one of them whispered. "The mountain's breathing." Oh. They continued for another 100 meters before the passage widened into a sealed bulkhead door, its center marked by a red stenciled warning in German, "Nicht öffnen, do not open." The air behind it pulsed in rhythmic bursts, like something alive. The team turned back, leaving markers as they fled toward daylight. By the time authorities returned to investigate, the tunnel had collapsed behind them, sealing itself in stone. Official reports called it an unstable geological incident. But the surviving spelunkers never forgot what they heard in that darkness, a mountain exhaling as if waking from a long, uneasy sleep. The collapse should have buried the secret forever, but mountains keep their own memories, and sometimes they let them surface again. 2 years later, a secondary entrance was found during geological surveying, an old ventilation shaft leading down into the same system the spelunkers had breached. This time, a government-backed research team descended, equipped with breathing gear and radiation monitors. What they found stunned even the most skeptical among them. The shaft opened into a colossal subterranean chamber, larger than any known wartime bunker, its walls reinforced with steel and lead. Dust lay thick over everything, but the facility itself was intact as if time had stopped. Rows of copper coils spiraled from floor to ceiling, connected to massive pressure tanks and glass tubes filled with a cloudy, amber-colored fluid. Instruments, meters, and switches remained untouched, labels still written in the spidery handwriting of 1,942 engineers. On one workbench sat a stack of blueprints stamped 1,944, each page yellowed but readable. Across one sheet, in crisp Gothic script, was the title, Continuum Antrieb, Phase Drei, Continuum Drive, Phase 3. The diagrams showed overlapping magnetic rings, power regulators, and handwritten formulas for something called Raumverdrängung, space displacement. Even stranger, a few of the machines still emitted a faint electrical hum. Power cables ran into the walls, disappearing into conduits that vanished deep into the rock. None of the researchers could explain where the current was coming from. The chamber temperature hovered at a steady 31 degrees Celsius, too warm for an unpowered underground structure. Instruments registered residual radiation, though no reactor was visible. The lead scientist, Dr. Albrecht, wrote in his field notes, "The machinery appears self-sustaining. Either it is feeding off geothermal energy or something else entirely." They documented everything, photographing the blueprints and recording the sounds of the humming machinery. But when their data was reviewed in Munich, several audio files were missing, replaced by bursts of static and a deep rhythmic pulse. Within weeks, the site was classified, sealed again under concrete. The official story called it an abandoned wartime generator. Yet those who had descended into that chamber knew better. The machines had not stopped. They had been waiting. The blueprints told one story. The lab's logbooks told another. Among the papers recovered from the subterranean chamber were bound reports labeled Versuchsprotokolle, experiment protocols signed by Dr. Heinrich Vogel himself. The handwriting was neat, meticulous, almost clinical, as if trying to impose order on something that defied comprehension. The earliest entries were routine, calibrations, electromagnetic readings, temperature data. But as the months of 1944 passed, the notes grew erratic, the results increasingly bizarre. Vogel wasn't just working with energy, he was trying to bend it, to make it fold in on itself. The logbooks describe a device constructed around a magnetic containment ring designed to produce Resonanzfelder resonance fields, powerful enough to distort the fabric of space itself. One report describes a metal sphere that vanished during testing and reappeared 6 seconds later, scorched and slightly warped, as if it had passed through something it was never meant to. Later entries call these occurrences displacement events. At first, Vogel celebrated them as success. Then came the failures, objects that disappeared and did not return. The chamber where the experiments were conducted was reinforced with lead and concrete and sealed with a double door that could only be opened from the outside. In March 1945, as Allied forces closed in, Vogel accelerated the testing schedule. The tone of his notes shifts from precision to desperation. One fragment reads, "Field stability achieved at 8.7 megacycles. Displacement confirmed. Awaiting return signal." Another, days later, "Organic matter unstable. Attempts on small animals unsuccessful." And then, the final entry, dated the 28th of April 1945, 3:16 a.m. Subject 7 did not return. There is no record of who or what Subject 7 was. The entry ends abruptly, the ink smeared as if the pen had been pulled from his hand mid-sentence. The next page is blank. Historians speculate that Vogel, driven by collapse all around him, might have decided to test the machine on himself, believing he could transcend defeat by stepping beyond the limits of physics. Others think Subject 7 was one of his assistants, or worse, one of the prisoners of war taken from nearby labor camps. Whatever the truth, the result was the same. At 3:16 a.m., everything stopped: the machinery, the lights, even time itself. And from that moment on, no one ever saw Dr. Heinrich Vogel alive again. When the research team finally understood what they had uncovered, the horror set in. The lab beneath the mountain had not been abandoned, it had been sealed. Every door was layered with lead and reinforced steel, designed to contain radiation or perhaps something far less measurable. The ventilation shafts were welded shut from the inside. The generator system, buried deep below the main chamber, still functioned, powered by an array of batteries and turbines that defied explanation. Engineers estimated the setup could have run autonomously for decades, possibly longer. Inside the storage vaults, they found sealed canisters labeled Stufe 4, Stage 4. Each container was lined with black glass and filled with an unknown viscous fluid. Radiation detectors spiked whenever the seals were disturbed. No one dared open them. The walls of the facility showed no corrosion, no decay, despite nearly 60 years underground. Instruments left exposed to air since 1945 still gleamed, their dials unstained by rust. It was as if the lab had been suspended in a bubble of time, untouched by entropy. In one corner, a wall clock hung frozen at 3:16 a.m., April 28, 1945, the exact time of Vogel's last log entry. The clock's mechanism was still wound, its gears frozen mid-tick, a second hand hovering just before completion. A technician who examined it claimed to feel a faint vibration when he touched the casing, as though the gears were still moving somewhere beyond sight. Nearby, a phonograph sat on a desk, its needle resting on a blank record. The inscription on the brass plate read, "Zurück wird niemand kommen, no one will return." The lead investigator, Dr. Albrecht, concluded that the facility had been deliberately entombed to contain something not merely radiation, but the lingering effects of Vogel's final experiment. "The structure wasn't built to protect the scientists," he wrote. "It was built to protect the world from what they created." After that report, the lab was sealed again under layers of concrete, classified as a hazardous wartime relic. But one question remained, haunting everyone who'd entered that place. If time truly stopped inside Vogel's chamber, then what happened to the man who stood at its center when it did? It was in the deepest section of the complex, beyond a sealed corridor thick with dust and silence, that the discovery was made. A team member noticed a smaller chamber branching off from the main lab, its entrance blocked by reinforced glass, clouded with condensation that had somehow never fully dried. When they wiped it clear, the beam of their flashlight revealed what at first seemed like a mannequin standing inside. But it wasn't. Behind the glass, within a containment unit filled with stale, yellowed air, stood a desiccated corpse in a white lab coat. The fabric was stiff, the skin mummified and drawn tight against the bones. Around its neck hung an identification badge, the print still legible despite the decades. Dr. Heinrich Vogel. His right hand rested against the glass, fingers splayed as if pressing outward. In his left, clutched so tightly that the paper had fused with his palm, was a note written in his own hand, 3 words that chilled everyone who saw them. Es hat funktioniert. It worked. On his wrist was a stainless steel watch, frozen at 3:16 a.m., its second hand perfectly aligned with the moment the lab's clock had stopped. The body showed no signs of trauma, no decay beyond natural dehydration. It was as if time itself had taken him gently, drying him into permanence. Forensics teams who later examined the remains noted an absence of bacterial degradation and a faint electromagnetic field surrounding the containment chamber, an anomaly that defied every instrument they used. The readings fluctuated subtly, as though something still pulsed beneath the glass. No one could determine how Vogel died or if he truly had. Some argued he'd been trapped when his experiment sealed the chamber. Others whispered that the experiment hadn't failed at all, that Vogel had succeeded in crossing a threshold no human should ever touch, only to find himself suspended between 2 realities, his body left behind as proof. The scientists who made the discovery refused to speak publicly, their statements signed under oath and immediately classified. But one of them, years later, would tell a colleague in a whisper, "He wasn't looking at us, he was looking through us, like he could see something we couldn't." Within 48 hours of the body's discovery, the mountain was overrun. Black vans without insignia arrived under armed escort. Personnel from both NATO and the Bundesnachrichtendienst, Germany's federal intelligence agency, established a perimeter that stretched for miles. Every recording, every sample, every photograph was confiscated. The excavation team was detained, questioned, and forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under penalty of imprisonment. Their official report was rewritten to describe the site as an unremarkable wartime storage facility. Publicly, the story vanished as quickly as it had surfaced. Those who tried to expose it didn't last long. A freelance journalist from Munich who leaked images of the glass chamber died in a supposed car accident days after publication. The photos disappeared from the archives within hours. Another reporter who wrote a piece connecting Vogel's research to early Cold War technology had his credentials revoked and was later found to have fabricated sources. Even university researchers who had analyzed the seized materials were abruptly reassigned or retired under pressure. The official statement released to the press was chillingly sterile. An underground Nazi bunker of no historical significance has been secured by authorities. No evidence of experimental technology was found. But inside scientific circles, the whispers never stopped. Some claimed the recovered blueprints were quietly shared with select defense contractors. Others said fragments of Vogel's research resurfaced in classified U.S. military patents decades ahead of their time, formulas referencing vacuum energy, electromagnetic resonance, and nonlinear temporal distortion. The details were impossible to verify, but the patterns were undeniable. And then there were the photographs, the few that escaped confiscation. Grainy, underexposed, but unmistakable. A skeletal man in a lab coat, hand pressed against the glass, eyes open, as if frozen mid-thought. They circulated in the darkest corners of the internet for years before disappearing completely. Still, those who'd seen them swore the same thing, that if you stared long enough, you could almost see the reflection of something glowing behind him, something moving, something that proved Dr. Heinrich Vogel's final words might not have been a confession, but a warning. Time has a way of burying secrets, but not forever. Decades after the mountain was sealed for the last time, fragments of Dr. Heinrich Vogel's research began to surface, slivers of brilliance scattered through classified archives, anonymous leaks, and scientific papers that seemed to know too much. In 2009, a physicist at the University of Zurich published an obscure paper on zero-point energy fluctuations. It referenced equations identical to those found in Vogel's blueprints formulas, far beyond anything publicly known in 1945. A year later, a U.S. defense patent quietly appeared under a shell corporation describing temporal field stabilization through magnetic resonance. The language was technical, detached, but to those who remembered Vogel's notes, it was unmistakable. Someone, somewhere, had his work. Rumors spread across academic circles and conspiracy forums alike. Some claimed Vogel's research had been absorbed into Cold War black projects, secret programs housed beneath facilities in Nevada, Siberia, and Eastern Europe, all dedicated to harnessing vacuum energy. Others pointed to the sudden leaps in propulsion and communications technology during the late 20th century and asked the question no one wanted to voice. Had we built upon the work of a man who tore open the fabric of reality? But there was another theory, one darker and far harder to dismiss. It claimed Vogel's final experiment hadn't failed at all, that his disappearance wasn't death, but departure. Some physicists who analyzed the surviving data noted that his last recorded energy surge produced a measurable space-time displacement field, an effect that shouldn't have been possible with 1,940 seconds technology. A few even argued that Vogel had become the first human to step through his own creation, leaving behind only the echo of his existence. Over the years, the legend evolved, whispered among those who studied the fringes of science. They said that on certain nights, near the sealed valley in the Bavarian Alps, the ground still vibrates faintly, and electronic devices begin to glitch, their screens flickering with static. Some hikers report hearing a low hum rising from beneath the stone, rhythmic and steady like a machine waiting for a signal. Governments deny everything, of course. The files remain sealed, the names redacted, the past rewritten, but the truth lingers like radiation unseen, persistent, waiting. And in the end, perhaps that final note said it all. Vogel hadn't just crossed a line, he'd erased it. Maybe Vogel didn't vanish into history. Maybe he vanished into something else entirely. This story was intense, but this story on the right-hand side is even more insane.